Economic mismanagement and corruption in Iraq are equivalent to a second insurgency. Stuart Bowen, US Special Inspector General for Iraq Reconstruction.
Welcome back to Inside Iraq. We are discussing Iraq humanitarian situation. Iraq prided itself on its educational system. That system today is crumbling. This is the story of one student.
I'm a student in the final year of secondary school. I wake up early in the morning and start by performing my ablutions and then offering the Fajr or dawn prayer. Then I head to the kitchen to prepare breakfast, as I live with my grandmother. After we've had breakfast, I get ready for school. Then I hit the road. I share a taxicab with a number of my schoolmates. We usually start very early, almost an hour before school starts. It's not just the traffic jams, but the repeated and ongoing searches at checkpoints. We struggle to reach school on time. Unfortunately, on a number of occasions when the US occupation forces were engaged in gun battles, they started firing randomly at students. Many students have been killed by random gunfire, including many of my close friends. I hope Iraq restores its stability and security. I also hope the occupation forces leave our homeland. Students live an unstable life simply because of the repeated explosions. We can't even afford the fuel for the oil lamps we study under. How then can Iraqi students carry on with their studies, succeed, or take a step forward in the face of all these hardships?
Still with us, Hans von Sponik, Jane Arraf and Saeed Haqqi. Saeed Haqqi, this crisis that has befallen Iraq, and you mentioned Holako when he invaded Iraq in 1256, is the biggest, most desperate situation in the modern history. Does the Iraqi government have the capacity to put things right, or do they need the help of international organization like yours, organization like the former employer of Hans von Sponik, the United Nations? Because for 5 years, things are not right.
I have reservation. Things are not right for the past 5 years. Let's go back to the salaries. When Hans, with due respect, he said there's no difference between before 2003, after 2003. In 2003, the doctor's salary was $12 a month, and the nurses was $6 a month. Doctor's salary at the Iraqi Red Crescent now gets about $2,000 or $4,000 a month, and the nurses about half that. So far as can the Iraqi government get out of this? I'm sure it can. The difference between the government of Iraq now and the government of Iraq before 2003, Saddam didn't know the difference between his pocket as well as the government's pocket.
Well, perhaps that applies to many pockets nowadays. If we are going to go by the records of Transparency International, Iraq is at the bottom of that list, just above Myanmar and Somalia. Corruption is rife in Iraq, but that is beside the point. Hans von Sponik, does it serve any purpose to shed light on responsibility, or the desperation is much bigger than responsibility and pointing fingers?
Well, I would say it doesn't help the Iraqi people too much if you start to equate who is more or less responsible. I think it's a legitimate demand that people have, that their government is trying to help them to get on the road to a better life. But it's also incumbent on the international community to make their contribution. What disturbs me very much these days is when I read in English and European newspapers about the progress in Iraq measured in terms of the lowering number of civilian casualties and American soldiers losing their lives. To me, that is a measure of immorality. If it was plus 1,000 Iraqis dying a month and now it is below, that is very immoral progress, I must say.
Let me get a comment from Jane Arraf, but before she comments, Jane, 2 days ago, the General Accounting Office of the United States Congress issued a scathing report against the Bush administration's claims that things in Iraq are improving. They just a few items. I don't have time to check them all, but when it comes to electricity production or even the readiness of the Iraqi forces to act independently from the Americans, it leaves a lot to be desired.
That's absolutely true, and I don't think anyone would dispute that, Jassim. But really what's changed here in the last few months is that things have gotten secure enough on the ground that there's that window of opportunity. And what it's meant to do is allow the Iraqi government to actually act like a government, allow U.S. troops to withdraw to some extent, and allow this country to kind of come together after that horrifying civil war that we've been seeing. So yes, absolutely, there are immense, serious problems, and one of the biggest problems that I hear over and over when I ask Iraqis what they think of their government, they say, what government? They're not seeing any evidence. They're not seeing evidence of essential services delivered. In fact, in a lot of these places I'm going through, it's still the U.S. military that's digging the wells, that's providing emergency funds for water treatment plants, and that's not a situation that can be sustained. And that really is the biggest problem. It has always been a mess here. It is still a mess here, but it has perhaps right now a window of opportunity for things to get somewhat better. And that's the view of a lot of Iraqis that I talk to on the ground. They don't have a lot of faith in their leaders. They don't have a lot of faith in government, but they are somewhat hopeful.
Let me get a quick response about this bleak assessment by the observation of Jane Saeed Haqqi.
I respect all these views.
It's bleak.
But,
sorry, I think it's bleak. We're talking a year ago was bleak.
Well, at least it's not as rosy as depicted by Saeed Haqqi. Go ahead, Saeed.
I'll tell you something. There are a lot of fingers in this pie, you know. If Iraq needs a lot of help. It's a complex, compound problem. Health was at zero level. Electricity was at zero level. Ground zero, almost all services. The electricity production in Iraq now is more than it was in 2003, but you need about 3 times what is needed. People never, well, not never, most of them didn't have air conditioning. Now each house is about 2 or 3 or 4 air conditioned. There was no cell phone. There was no sort of internet.
I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Dr. Saeed. I really do have to interrupt because...
Go ahead, Jane. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, but every house does not have air conditioning. Perhaps that's a metaphor. I just have to say that it would be wonderful if every house had air conditioning, although there isn't the electricity to support that. But there's still immense pockets of poverty, and I think all of us here deal with that.
Jane, they have the machines of these air conditioning. There's over 1 million cars in 1 year.
Well, let's move on. Hans von Sponik, let me get back to you, Hans. Iraqis, like the Palestinians, they are proud of their education. Their parents, they love nothing more than send their children to the best schools and best universities in the world. Iraq in the early 80s was declared by the United Nations, by UNESCO, that is literacy free. And only through education, the Iraqis, they can come out. Now we hear the figure that a lot of families, they don't send children to school. There are 400,000 orphans without parents. How do you look at the educational system as a remedy for Iraq's desperate situation?
I would like to say to that, it may help young girls and boys in Iraq to start preparing for life, but it doesn't help. It's too late for any help for at least 2 generations of young Iraqis that suffered under sanctions, that suffered under the occupation, that many of whom live in neighboring Syria and Jordan without any education, sitting in front of TVs and eating potato chips, if anything. They are not going to be the equivalent of their fathers and grandfathers that led in the Middle East a progressive social system. So I think there is a great amount of urgency now to get this education system back on the road.
Jane Arraf, you are our point woman in Baghdad. Summarize the situation for us and wrap this program for me.
Well, I would have to say it's not quite as horrible as it was. It's not as horrible as we thought it might be. There are a lot of places where things are dramatically better, and I do not use that word lightly. When people are actually going out, and I think this is a real sign of confidence, building shops fronted with glass, that means that they're not afraid so much of the car bombs anymore. Having said that, it's a different city than the one we knew. I think Hans would be shocked by it. The concrete walls, the barbed wire, the people who are gone, who have died, who have emigrated. It is forever changed in many ways, in terrible ways, but there is a little bit more, quite a bit more than a glimmer of hope right now, I would say.
The Iraq you knew, the Iraq Hans von Sponeck knew, and perhaps the Iraq we all knew, has gone and changed forever. Jane Arraf, Hans von Sponeck, Saeed Haqqi, thank you for being guests on Inside Iraq. To access the show and to send us your comments, please go to aljazeera.net/English. That's all the time we have for this week. Join me next week when we take another look inside Iraq. Goodbye.